No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, we're going to be talking about the same thing we were talking about last Monday. This is going to be part 2 in this kind of a 4-part series, talking about why a team might be dysfunctional as opposed to high performing. Last week, if you missed it, go back and check it out. We talked a little bit about how a lack of trust amongst people on the team can really contribute to a team not being high performing, which we defined as, being able to deliver whatever the expected result is over a sustained period of time with the same people. And so if you get great results because people can't stand to be working for you, so they're quitting all the time, and you're getting new people in, and you kind of run them into the ground, that might be sustained results, but it's not with the same people. And so that's not high performing. High performing is this kind of cohesion that exists where everybody is contributing to those goals and the goals are being hit. A lack of trust can contribute to that not happening. On this episode, I want to talk about people being afraid of having conflict with either their boss, you, or their coworkers, and how that can lead to dysfunction on a team that contributes to a lack of results. And I think this might be where I think a lot of the rubber meets the road on this whole topic, especially when you're talking about multi-generational workforces, because I think there's a real lost in translation element that happens when it comes to the definition of conflict, the definition of feedback and what feedback is and how to give it, when it comes to people of different generations, without necessarily implying that any one generation does it better than another. It's just they're almost speaking different languages.
Yeah, and I think in the context of this being about like the high-performing teams, I'm with you. Like, I think conflict is good. It's necessary. It's needed. Like, you can't have a good, healthy debate if you don't have some conflict, if you don't have different perspectives, if you're not willing to stand for what you're thinking or what you believe in, but also the element of that is being open to listen to others. And if you get new information, maybe you make a different decision, or you gain some new perspective, you reconsider, and maybe you change your position completely or slightly or adjust it or whatever the case is. But I agree with you that, like, I think the conflict element is so important from a leadership standpoint, because you want to create spaces where it's okay for people to have conflicts. You want to spend the time with a team to help them understand, how do you have a healthy conflict? How do you have conflict where it's not a personal attack? How do you when you hear an element of conflict, whether somebody doesn't agree with you or they say something like, I think that's a horrible idea, how do you not take that personal? And how do you look to listen and to understand? Like, there's so much to unpack in there that I think in leadership, we typically address it when it goes sideways. Something bad happens, or somebody has a response, or somebody gets caught in their feelings because of a comment that was made or the way that it was addressed. And like, you know what, sometimes like there's absolutely those moments where you have to have that coaching with the individual and you have to talk through it.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot of those smaller conflicts that happen that don't cause the reaction of the emotion or just the visceral feelings people may have for one another. It's these little small conflicts that we maybe hear or observe, but don't take the time to dig deeper into or give it a chance to kind of breathe a little bit and like have some dialogue and work through that idea, or say something like, okay, you know what, like, hey, Chris, I know that your initial thought on this was like you had a different idea, and I want us to have some space to talk about that, because I really respect what Lorenzo kind of brought to the table here, but I also I think it'd be good for us to have some healthy debate. I think it'd be good for us to like start from a place of seeing this as different places, different perspectives, different ways of doing things, because I think that if we can do this in a way that is productive and helpful, I think we can get a great idea of this. We can land there. So I do want to pause, because I think it's really important that we allow this debate to happen.
Right.
And so like again, just making the space and the room for that, I think is so critical to then helping people to like build the trust amongst each other to the point where they know that they can share how they're thinking or what they're feeling without this like, oh my gosh, like I'm gonna hurt somebody's feelings, or how are they gonna think about me, or do they think that I'm targeting them and they're a bad idea? Like none of that is happening. You really do your best to bring that down.
Right. So what you brought up there in terms of the element of leadership, which is creating the space for this, what that does is it validates the perspective, it validates the existence of another perspective as being on equal playing field as the first proposed perspective, or the maybe the more popular perspective. And here's why that's important. When we talk about conflict from a healthy perspective, two NFL teams playing in the Super Bowl, that's a conflict, but nobody worries about that because it's assumed that they are evenly matched. When people think of conflict and start associating it with a negative, they look at it through the lens of some type of power imbalance. So a conflict when there is a power imbalance is different than a conflict when there is not one. And if you are in a leadership role and there is a conflict between two people where there is no power imbalance, oftentimes the right thing to do as a leader is nothing, is to allow that to play out as it should, because there's no need for you as the leader to go in and balance the power. It already exists. And oftentimes leaders can jump in and try to solve the problem or figure out, or help the conflict be figured out. And it will be viewed negatively as in the long run, because it will be viewed as that leader is taking the side of whoever ended up being, coming out on top of that thing. Where it is important for leaders to step in is when there is a power imbalance. And I'm not just talking about a one on paper, a line level employee and a senior director in an organization. Obviously, that's a power imbalance. I'm talking about a social power imbalance. And so if you're in a group meeting with everybody, there will be people in your team who are higher up on the totem pole when it comes to just how people perceive them in the organization. They're the popular ones, so to speak, the ones that everybody likes. They probably work hard. They get along with people. There's a reason that they are kind of looked at with an air of authority when they open their mouths to talk. That doesn't mean they're right all the time, though. And if someone else wants to say something that is a differing perspective, and it goes against the person who is, kind of higher up on that totem pole, that the other person is less likely to open their mouths to begin with. Not because they think they're wrong, but because they think that their status amongst the group is a power imbalance from the other person, and the other person's perspective is going to be taken as right, not because it's right, but because of who they are. And that's when it's really important as a leader to jump in and say, to not validate what the perspective is, but to validate the absolute importance of there being that perspective and of it being kind of hashed out. And oftentimes when you do that, even if the right perspective is not the person who had to be, validated, what you've done there is you've said, in my team, at this table, everybody's perspective is valid. And so if you have something that you want to speak up about that is rooted in something, bigger than yourself, you want to do well for the team, you think this is the right thing to do, you should be able to speak up and say something and know that the rest of the team is going to have your back. Maybe not that they won't pick it apart and tell you why it's wrong, but that they at least will validate the fact that you wanted to speak up to begin with. That's where the leadership element of this is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought up kind of the social authority element, because I also think about, and we've talked about this before, but like when you have meetings with a lot of people, and I think we even had an episode about this, about like who are the people that should be in the room, and what does that look like? I think that's such an important part of this understanding, is that there are many times when you have a leadership meeting, and based upon your team size and what you work through, you're going to have those that have been here, that have some tenure, that have some experience. Maybe there's maybe there's a level or two in the same room, meaning that maybe you've got like a, kind of like a supervisory level and then a manager level, but collectively this is a leadership team. You're going to have some of that kind of collection in the room. You're going to have those that may be brand new to leadership. This is maybe their first leadership role. You're going to have those, again, that have had experience, whether in the current role that they've had, the company they've in, or other types of companies. But you have these differing elements of people in the room where there will be this kind of natural order of kind of who speaks when and who is more comfortable pushing back on ideas and who is more comfortable providing the ideas. Like all these kind of things are at play. And I think it's important in leadership to be really conscious of that and to look at that. And sometimes you have to let that conversation go, to your point. Sometimes you do nothing. Sometimes that there's an element where you have to allow there to be some dialogue and some debate, just because there's also an opportunity to kind of observe how do people work through a conflict? How do people, get their point across, or how do people find common ground, or how do people kind of bring down the level in the room? Like, these are all really important things that if you don't allow there to be conflict from time to time, you don't get a chance to assess these things. And so I think that as a leader, that's a big part of it, is like knowing that if you have a collection of people in the room in this meeting where there is strategy, there's decision making, you can't hold that against a leader that's new to role, or maybe bringing up ideas or thoughts that that most in the room would be like, that's not going to work, because like we have enough experience to know that that's not something that would happen. But to that leader, that might be really exciting. That might be an idea they just had. They've never seen that before, type of thing. So you have to be conscious of those things to make sure that people still feel welcome. They still feel they have a voice in that room, and that you're not allowing, like, you're not creating a space for the conflict again to be like kind of personal or demeaning, but it's about the conflict of the idea or the strategy. So I just think that there's a lot of things that leaders should be thinking about when you're going to have meetings where there's potential conflict on strategies or ideas or that type of thing. What are you doing? How are you setting up the space for that? How are you considering how you're going to react in those moments to make sure that people have the chance to share how they feel and what they see, but at the same time, it doesn't go sideways and people start to really take in like personal attacks or feelings of not feeling great about their ideas or their thoughts.
Right. I look back to, my wife and I took marriage classes before we got married. We had to do that through our church that we were with, and the one of the kind of the parts of the program wasn't talking about how not to fight or to argue. It was talking about how to fight fair. It was actually called How to Fight Fair. And so it kind of acknowledges that there's no such thing as a marriage or a relationship of any kind that doesn't have conflict. There's no such thing as a relationship that doesn't have fighting. But if you want to get through it, you have to know how to fight fair. And that's what this is. That's what this managing the relationships through conflict in the workplace is really similar to how you would manage it with any other relationship, is by fighting fair. And fighting fair means that you're not trying to attack the person, but rather whatever the argument is, whatever the perspective is, that you're not using an emotional argument. You're using an argument that is rooted in data, so it doesn't look like you have a personal agenda here. You're advocating for something that is bigger than yourself. That you show empathy in validating what the other person is saying, so that even if their idea isn't being validated, they as a person are being validated for the action of bringing up the idea to begin with. All of these things are ways that you can, have conflict with your coworkers, or peers in a way that doesn't shut down the conflict, because that's when that it's unhealthy and that it's dysfunctional, is when anytime conflict starts, it gets shut down really quickly. Not because people worked through it and got out the other side, but because there was such a fear of the conflict that the moment something kind of reared up that was going down the conflict path, somebody said something and it shut it down real quick, and then people are able to move forward. That is not healthy. Just because the conflict was avoided doesn't mean that you did the right thing. Again, it's not a lack of conflict that you're looking for as the leader here. It's a fear of conflict that you're looking for that is the problem. And so how your people you kind of push back on each other, and watching them and making sure that they are, for lack of a better term, fighting fair. Make sure they're doing that. That's where you as a leader, need to step in or not step in. And if people are fighting fair, a really strong argument can be made that there are very few times when you as a leader need to step in and solve an issue, unless whatever the issue is an objectively right answer for something that is more policy driven. Sure, go in and give them the teaching that they need. But most of these things are not that. Most of these things where the conflict is occurring are not rooted in things that can be looked up in a manual. They're rooted in things that are subjective, and where people have differing opinions on how to do something based on their own skill set, and neither one may be wholly right. And so allowing these things to play out, as long as people are fighting fair, is oftentimes the right way to go as a leader.
Absolutely. And with that brings us to this episode's 1 minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
All right, for this episode's 1 minute hack, here's what I want you to do. The next time you're in a group setting, I want you to do this exercise. It doesn't take very long. It's called Bad Ideas Only. It's a fantastic exercise that really helps figure out how to work through conflict. And the way you do it is you run an exercise where you're trying to solve for a problem, and it's a real problem. It's an actual real problem, but you ask for people to solve the problem using ideas that are objectively bad. So they have to say something that would be an idea of how it actually would solve the problem, like it's a legitimate way to solve the problem, but it's a terrible idea, and it's clear that it's a terrible idea to everybody in the room. And then everybody else has to pick it apart and say why it's a bad idea, and realistically why this wouldn't work. So an example could be, how do we make customers more happy? Well, the way to make customers more happy is every time they come in the building, we give them free things, free product. We just give it to them, because clearly that would make them happy. Well, okay, so let's pick it apart now. Let's talk about why that isn't a realistic way to move forward. And the reason why this is such an important endeavor is that when a person is picking apart a bad idea that was said intentionally as a bad idea, there's no fear of that person thinking, oh, I'm attacking the person who said the idea. I'm just attacking the idea. There's no fear from the person who gave the idea of feeling like they have their own identity wrapped up in that idea, because it wasn't really their idea. It was a bad idea to begin with, it was a fake idea to begin with. But going through the motions of picking these apart can show how to do this correctly, because you still have to pick it apart in a respectful way. You still have to say why you'd go out of business if you just gave stuff away. And you don't respond to the idea by saying, no, idiot, we can't do that, we'll go out of business. You talk legitimately about why it would be a bad idea. Well, if you look at the margins, this is what would happen to the margins if we did that. So you legitimize the idea by also picking it apart and saying why it wouldn't work, as if the person said it as a real idea. Do this with your team, and you will have this disconnect, this intentional disconnect that occurs between ideas coming up and the identity and feelings and egos of the people who are saying them. If you can get that detachment to occur, you are well on your way to having this kind of healthy conflict that occurs, because when the ideas do come up and they're real going forward, there's not going to be this like hesitation to pick it apart for fear of, that person feeling attacked as a person, or kind of the conflict that goes the wrong way. So very, very important and very good exercise to do. I've done it personally, and it works really well.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack. And again, I think these are the times when you could have some fun with the team, and you're setting the stage for the ability for us to have some dialogue, to have a good laugh, to build the skill. Into your point, like how do you take this idea seriously, and then what would you do to say, like, how come that wouldn't work? Because that is exactly what we're asking people to do in the other space. And I think that over time, this is not, in my opinion, just like you do this one time and that's it. This is something that you do from time to time to continue to bring a little lightness to the room, but also, again, to just work through that skill for it to be okay. Because it also, what it does, I think, is it allows there to be the acceptance of it's okay to have a bad idea. Mm-hmm. Like we need to start somewhere, and I think somewhere that idea will spark something that will get us to where we want to go. And we need that type of energy. We need people that are willing to step up front and say those things. And when it comes to the conflict element of a high-performing team, that's the space that you get into. Is high-performing teams understand the value of conflict. They're like, hey, Chris, I need you for like 10 minutes, man. I got this thing that I'm working on, and can you just tell me, like, is this crazy? Like, do you see this? What do you think? Or, hey, here's my idea. Do me a favor. Pick this thing apart Right. I want you to just like completely pick this apart, because when I bring it to the team tomorrow, I want to make sure that I've already kind of addressed some of the things that maybe I'm not seeing. That's an example of extremely healthy conflict on a high performing team, as I'm actually asking you and leveraging you for having a different perspective to tell me that some of these things might not work, or it might be a bad idea, or here's what I missed. But I'm actually looking forward to that because I know it's going to help me in the next conflict that I have, which is with a larger team. So I'm limiting how much I'm gonna, learn in that space to then take it to them to then get some more to then come back around again. So I just wanted to share that kind of as an example of how healthy conflict is really, really important in a high performing team.
Absolutely. It's no different than, when a tech company says, "Hey, I'll give you I'll give $1 million to anybody who can hack into this piece of software." Right? And it's like they're not challenging them from a standpoint of ego. They're not saying this is unhackable. They're saying, I'd rather pay you $1 million and find out where this vulnerability is than have that vulnerability come out later on, and it could cost me millions and millions of dollars later on. So this is where the rubber meets the road. You intentionally set up the spaces when the consequences are zero, and you learn to work through it so that when something real does happen, you've exercised that muscle. You know how to move forward and move through it, and it doesn't cause real rifts in the team.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.